Welcome, dear listener, to another gentle journey through the corridors of history. Tonight we venture into a time both distant and strangely familiar, where cobblestone streets echo with the footsteps of those who dared to face humanity's greatest fears. Make yourself comfortable in your favorite resting place, perhaps with a warm blanket nearby, as we explore the world of Master Aldrich, a physician who would become known as one of the shadow healers during the Great Pestilence of the 14th century. In the year 1347, as autumn painted the leaves in shades of amber and crimson, the ancient city of Valdres awakened to another day of ordinary medieval life. The narrow streets wound between timber-framed houses like ribbons, their upper stories leaning toward each other as if sharing whispered secrets. Smoke curled lazily from countless chimneys, carrying with it the mingled aromas of baking bread, burning wood, and the countless activities of daily life. Master Aldrich rose before dawn in his modest chamber above the apothecary shop on Healers Lane. The stone walls were cool to the touch, and morning light filtered through small diamond-paned windows, casting gentle patterns across the worn wooden floors. He was a man of 32 years, with thoughtful brown eyes and hands that had grown skilled in the mixing of herbs and the preparation of remedies according to the ancient teachings passed down through generations of healers. The city of Valdres was home to some 15,000 souls, a bustling center of trade where merchants from distant lands brought spices, silks, and stories of far-off places. The great cathedral bells marked the hours with their deep, resonant chimes, while the marketplace hummed with the voices of traders calling out their wares. Bakers kneaded their daily bread, blacksmiths hammered glowing iron into useful shapes, and scribes carefully copied manuscripts by the light of flickering candles. In those days, the practice of medicine was guided by the wisdom of the ancient Greek physicians, particularly the teachings of Galen and Hippocrates. The human body, it was understood, was governed by four essential humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. When these vital fluids existed in perfect harmony, health flourished. When they fell into imbalance, illness followed as surely as storm clouds brought rain. Master Aldrich had spent 7 years studying at the University of Montpellier, one of the most renowned centers of medical learning in all of Christendom. There, surrounded by dusty tomes and learned professors, he had mastered the art of reading the stars for medical guidance, the proper methods of bloodletting, and the complex preparation of medicinal compounds. His knowledge encompassed the virtues of countless herbs: lavender for calming the spirits, willow bark for reducing fever, and dozens of other remedies drawn from garden, field, and forest. The young physician's daily routine began with prayers in the small chapel adjacent to his shop, followed by the careful examination of his supplies. Glass vials lined wooden shelves, each containing precious substances: mercury for treating various ailments, ground pearls believed to strengthen the heart, and exotic spices brought from the distant Indies. His instruments were few but precious: bronze scales for measuring compounds, silver lancets for bloodletting, and ceramic vessels for preparing his mixtures. On this particular morning, as golden sunlight crept across the cobblestones of Healers Lane, Master Aldrich could not have imagined that within a few short months, his quiet life of scholarship and healing would be transformed forever. The great pestilence that would later be known as the Black Death was already making its way across distant lands, traveling the same trade routes that brought prosperity to cities like Valdres, from the bustling ports of the Mediterranean, where sailors spoke in hushed tones of entire crews found dead aboard their vessels, to the great trading centers of the East, where caravans arrived with fewer men than had departed. An invisible enemy was advancing with relentless determination. It moved with the speed of galloping horses and the stealth of morning mist, respecting neither crown nor cottage in its terrible harvest. But for now, in the peaceful morning light of Valdres, Master Aldrich went about his accustomed duties. He ground herbs in his marble mortar, their fragrances filling the air with the scents of thyme, rosemary, and sage. He prepared poultices for the baker's wife, who suffered from swollen joints, and mixed a tonic for the merchant Benedetto, whose stomach troubles had plagued him through the changing seasons. The city's inhabitants trusted in the wisdom of their physicians, in the protection of their patron saints, and in the natural order of things that had governed their lives since time immemorial. Children played in the narrow alleys between houses, their laughter echoing off stone walls. Women gathered at the public wells to draw water and share the news of their neighborhoods. Men pursued their trades with the steady rhythm of generations, each day following the patterns established by their fathers and grandfathers. Before them, the great cathedral of St. Erasmus dominated the city's skyline, its twin towers reaching toward heaven like stone prayers. Within its walls, monks chanted the canonical hours, their voices rising and falling in the ancient melodies that had been sung for countless generations. The cathedral's bells marked the passage of time, matins before dawn, prime at sunrise, terce at mid-morning, and so forth through the cycle of the day. In the marketplace, merchants displayed their goods on wooden tables and colorful cloths spread upon the ground. Bolts of fine wool from England, silk ribbons from distant Cathay, and spices from the mysterious lands beyond the Great Sea created a feast for the senses. The air was filled with the sounds of bargaining, the clatter of wooden wheels on stone, and the calls of vendors advertising their wares in voices trained to carry across the busy square. Master Aldrich often visited the market to purchase the ingredients for his remedies. He knew each trader by name and reputation, understanding which merchant offered the finest saffron, whose honey was purest, and where to find the rare minerals needed for his more complex preparations. The old woman Margarita sold the best herbs, dried and bundled with care in her sunny garden outside the city walls. Young Pietro, the spice merchant's son, could identify any substance by scent alone and often helped Aldrich locate particularly elusive ingredients. The physician's shop occupied the ground floor of a 3-story building constructed of honey-colored stone quarried from the hills surrounding Valdres. The upper floors served as his living quarters, while the basement provided cool storage for his more delicate preparations. Thick wooden beams supported the structure, their surfaces darkened with age and carved with the marks of the craftsmen who had shaped them decades earlier. Inside the shop, everything was arranged with meticulous care. Wooden shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, holding hundreds of ceramic pots, glass bottles, and leather pouches, each carefully labeled in Master Aldrich's precise script. The air was perfumed with the mingled scents of countless medicinal substances, the sharp bite of vinegar, the sweetness of rose petals, the earthiness of dried mushrooms, and the mysterious fragrances of exotic resins. A large oak table dominated the center of the room, its surface polished smooth by years of use. Here, Master Aldrich prepared his remedies, carefully measuring and mixing according to the formulas he had learned during his university years. Brass scales ensured precise measurements, while marble mortar and pestles, inherited from his predecessor, served to grind and blend ingredients into healing compounds. The windows of the shop were fitted with thick glass panes, a luxury that spoke to the prosperity that medical practice could bring to a skilled practitioner. Through these windows, passers-by could observe the physician at his work, reassured by the sight of his careful attention to detail and scholarly concentration. Trust was essential in the practice of medicine, and Master Aldrich had earned the confidence of his patients through years of dedicated service and successful treatments. His reputation extended beyond the city walls to the surrounding countryside, where farmers and shepherds would journey for days to seek his counsel. They brought with them the simple ailments of rural life, wounds that would not heal, fevers that lingered through the changing seasons, and the mysterious maladies that seemed to strike without warning or apparent cause. Master Aldrich treated each patient with equal care. Whether they were wealthy merchants who could afford his finest remedies, or humble peasants who paid in eggs, grain, or promises of future service, the social structure of medieval Valdres was as carefully ordered as the ingredients in Master Aldrich's shop. At the apex stood Lord Geoffrey de Montfort, whose castle overlooked the city from its perch on a nearby hill. Below him in the hierarchy came the wealthy merchants, the guild masters, and the learned clergy. Master Aldrich occupied a respected position in this social order, his education and skills placing him among the city's notable citizens. The Guild of Physicians maintained strict standards for the practice of medicine, requiring years of apprenticeship followed by university education for those who would serve the public. Master Aldrich had fulfilled these requirements with distinction, and his name was inscribed in the Guild's great book alongside those of his colleagues. This membership brought both privileges and responsibilities, including the obligation to serve the city in times of particular need. Such times seemed distant on this peaceful morning as Master Aldrich completed his preparations for the day ahead. He donned his long robe of dark blue wool, the color that marked his profession, and placed upon his head the soft cap that physicians wore as a sign of their learning. His leather satchel, well worn from daily use, contained the basic tools of his trade: lancets for bloodletting, small bottles of essential remedies, and the written records of his ongoing treatments. The morning's first patient arrived as the cathedral bells chimed the hour of prime. Dame Isabella, the widow of a prosperous cloth merchant, suffered from the joint pain that often accompanied the advancing years. Master Aldrich examined her swollen fingers with gentle care, noting the warmth and inflammation that suggested an excess of hot humors in her system. He prescribed a course of cooling herbs to be taken as teas, along with poultices of comfrey and willow bark to reduce the swelling dot as Dame Isabella departed. Expressing her gratitude for his kind attention, Master Aldrich reflected on the satisfaction that his calling provided. To ease suffering, to restore health, to see the light of hope return to worried faces, these rewards made worthwhile the long years of study and the daily challenges of medical practice. He could not know that within a few short months, such simple pleasures would be swept away by circumstances beyond any physician's power to control. The second patient of the day was young Marcus, the baker's apprentice who had scalded his hand while tending the ovens. Master Aldrich cleaned the burn with gentle care, applied a soothing unguent made from honey and healing herbs, and wrapped the injury in clean linen. He instructed the boy in the proper care of the wound and sent him away with additional supplies for changing the dressing. And so the morning progressed in its accustomed rhythm, each patient bringing their particular needs and concerns to the physician's door. Master Aldrich listened to their symptoms with careful attention, examined their ailments with practiced skill, and prescribed treatments according to the medical wisdom he had acquired through years of study and experience. It was a good life, filled with purpose and respect. Bounded by the familiar routines of a well-ordered medieval city, the great marketplace began to fill with people as the morning advanced, and the sounds of commerce drifted through the windows of the physician's shop. Carts loaded with goods from the surrounding countryside rumbled across the cobblestones, their wooden wheels creating a steady rhythm that had become as familiar as breathing to the city's inhabitants. Children ran between the stalls, their voices bright with excitement as they discovered the treasures that trade had brought to their doorstep in the cathedral. The morning service proceeded with its ancient dignity, the voices of the choir rising in harmonies that had echoed through these stone walls for generations. The great bells marked the canonical hours, their bronze voices calling the faithful to prayer and reminding all who heard them of the eternal order that governed both heaven and earth. Monks moved through the shadowed aisles, their sandaled feet whispering against the worn stone floors. As they went about their holy duties, Master Aldrich paused in his work to listen to the bells, as was his custom, using their familiar chimes to order his day and maintain connection with the spiritual life that enriched the temporal world. Like most educated men of his time, he found no conflict between his scientific studies and his religious faith, viewing both as different paths to understanding the divine order that governed all creation. The physician's lunch was simple but nourishing. Bread baked that morning by Master Thomas the baker, cheese from the dairy outside the city walls, and wine from the vineyards that covered the sunny hillsides surrounding Valdres. He ate at the small table in his private chamber, reviewing his notes from the morning's treatments and planning the afternoon's work. The records he kept were detailed and careful, documenting each patient's symptoms, the treatments prescribed, and the results observed over time. This information would prove invaluable in developing his understanding of various ailments and refining his therapeutic approaches. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the cobblestones, Master Aldrich prepared for his visits to patients who were too ill to travel to his shop. These house calls were an important part of his practice, allowing him to observe his patients in their familiar surroundings and to understand better the circumstances that might contribute to their ailments. He gathered his portable medicine chest, a sturdy wooden box fitted with numerous small compartments for various remedies, and set out through the winding streets of Valdres. The first stop was the home of Master William the goldsmith, whose wife had been delivered of their fourth child just a week before. Lady Anne was recovering well from the birth, but medieval women faced many dangers in the weeks following delivery, and careful attention from a skilled physician could mean the difference between health and serious complications. Master Aldrich examined both mother and child, finding both in excellent condition. The baby, a healthy boy with his father's strong features, would likely grow up to continue the family's prosperous business. From the goldsmith's house, Master Aldrich made his way to the humble dwelling where old Martin the porter lay suffering from a fever that had persisted for several days. The small house, with its single room and earthen floor, spoke of a lifetime spent in honest labor rather than the accumulation of wealth. But Master Aldrich treated his poorest patients with the same care and attention he devoted to the wealthy, recognizing that suffering knew no boundaries of class or station. Martin's fever had begun to break, suggesting that the cooling herbs and careful bloodletting prescribed earlier were having their desired effect. The old man's color was better, and his breathing had become less labored. Master Aldrich adjusted the treatment slightly, reducing the dosage of fever-reducing herbs and adding a tonic to help restore the patient's strength as he recovered. The afternoon's final visit took Master Aldrich to the monastery of St. Benedict, located just outside the city walls. Brother Francis, the elderly monk who served as the monastery's librarian, had been suffering from failing eyesight, a common affliction among those who spent their lives reading and copying manuscripts by candlelight. Master Aldrich could do little to restore vision that had been gradually dimming over many years, but he provided remedies to ease the strain and discomfort that accompanied the condition. The monastery library was one of Master Aldrich's favorite places, filled as it was with precious volumes on medicine, natural philosophy, and the healing arts. Brother Francis had become both patient and colleague over the years, and their conversations often ranged widely over matters of scholarly interest. Today, the elderly monk spoke of disturbing reports that had reached the monastery through their correspondence with religious houses in distant lands. Strange tales come to us from the East, Brother Francis said, his voice troubled as he carefully returned a manuscript to its proper place on the library shelf. Brother Augustine writes from Constantinople of a peculiar sickness that has appeared in the great trading cities. Ships arrive in port with their crews already dead, and the disease spreads like wildfire through the population. Master Aldrich listened with the professional interest that any physician would show when hearing of new forms of illness, but he felt no particular alarm. Reports of distant plagues were not uncommon, and most such outbreaks remained confined to their regions of origin. The medical theories of the time suggested that diseases were largely influenced by local conditions, the quality of the air, the nature of the water, and the particular combinations of celestial influences that affected different regions. Such reports often grow in the telling, Master Aldrich replied thoughtfully. A fever that carries off a few souls becomes a great pestilence in the minds of those who hear the tale at third or fourth hand. Still, I shall be interested to learn more as reports arrive from more reliable sources. The two men parted with their usual courtesies, Brother Francis expressing his gratitude for the physician's care, and Master Aldrich promising to return within the week to check on his patient's condition. The walk back to the city took him along a pleasant path that wound between fields, where late autumn crops were being gathered for the winter ahead. The countryside surrounding Valdres was fertile and well tended, supporting not only the city's population, but also providing surplus goods for trade with other regions. As evening approached and the setting sun painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, Master Aldrich returned to his shop to complete the day's work. He updated his patient records, prepared remedies for the following day's treatments, and organized his supplies with the careful attention to detail that characterized all his professional activities. The familiar routines brought satisfaction and a sense of accomplishment as another day of healing work drew to its close. The physician's evening meal was shared with Master Thomas, the baker, and Dame Margaret, the widow who managed the household of the building where they all lived. These informal gatherings had become a pleasant tradition, providing companionship and the opportunity to share the day's news and experiences. Tonight, their conversation touched on the usual topics: the state of trade, the weather prospects for the coming winter, and the minor scandals and celebrations that formed the fabric of city life. Master Thomas spoke of a new apprentice who showed unusual promise in the intricate art of bread making, while Dame Margaret related news of her daughter's upcoming marriage to a young merchant from a neighboring city. Master Aldrich shared what he could of his professional activities without violating the confidentiality that his patients deserved, and all three enjoyed the sense of community that these simple meals provided as the cathedral bells chimed Compline. The final service of the day, Master Aldrich retired to his chamber to spend an hour reading before sleep. Tonight, he chose a volume on the properties of medicinal herbs, written by a learned Arab physician whose works had been translated into Latin by the scholars of Cordova. The intricate knowledge contained in such texts never ceased to amaze him, and he often discovered new insights that could be applied to his practice. The flickering light of his oil lamp cast dancing shadows on the stone walls as Master Aldrich read of remedies derived from plants that grew in distant deserts and mountain slopes. Some of these substances could be obtained through the extensive trade networks that connected Valdres with the wider world, while others remained exotic curiosities that he might never have the opportunity to employ. Still, knowledge was never wasted, and even theoretical understanding could prove valuable in unexpected circumstances. Outside his window, the city of Valdres settled into its nightly quiet. The last merchants closed their stalls and shuttered their shops, while families gathered around their hearths for the evening meal and the sharing of the day's experiences. Night watchmen began their rounds, calling out the hours and maintaining the security that allowed honest citizens to sleep peacefully in their beds. The familiar sounds of a well-ordered city at rest provided a comforting background to Master Aldrich's reading as sleep began to claim him. The physician offered his customary prayers of gratitude for another day of successful practice and asked for divine guidance in the work that lay ahead. He could not know that forces were already in motion that would challenge everything he had learned about the nature of disease and the limits of medical knowledge. The great pestilence was advancing with each passing day, carried along the same trade routes that brought prosperity to cities like Valdres, and soon the comfortable certainties of medieval medical practice would be swept away by circumstances. beyond any physician's power to control. But for now, in the peaceful darkness of his chamber, Master Aldrich rested in the satisfaction of duty fulfilled and looked forward to another day of serving his community's needs. The future would bring its challenges in due time, and he would meet them with the skills, knowledge, and dedication that had guided his life thus far. Tomorrow would dawn with its own opportunities for healing and service, and that was sufficient for the present moment. Chapter 2. The Gathering Storm Winter arrived in Valdres with its customary beauty and hardship, blanketing the city in pristine white snow that transformed the medieval streets into a wonderland of crystalline perfection. The narrow alleys became channels of packed snow, worn smooth by the passage of countless feet, while icicles hung like nature's own decorations from the eaves of timber-framed houses. Smoke rose straight up in the still, cold air from hundreds of chimneys, creating a haze that softened the harsh edges of winter and filled the atmosphere with the comforting scent of burning wood. Master Aldrich found the winter months particularly rewarding in his practice, as the cold weather brought with it the seasonal ailments that had afflicted humanity since time immemorial. Coughs and fevers, joint pains aggravated by the damp cold, and the various complaints that seemed to flourish when people were confined together in close quarters during the long, dark months. His shop became a haven of warmth and healing, where patients could find relief from winter's harsh embrace. The physician had spent the autumn months preparing for winter's challenges, laying in stores of the herbs and minerals that would be needed when fresh materials became unavailable. His basement storage rooms were filled with carefully preserved medicinal plants, their healing properties captured and concentrated through time-honored methods of drying, distillation, and extraction. Large ceramic jars held the various compounds that formed the foundation of his practice: ground willow bark for reducing fevers, preparations of chamomile for calming troubled minds, and dozens of other substances that represented centuries of accumulated medical wisdom. During the short days of December and January, Master Aldrich's daily routine adapted to the rhythms of winter life. He rose later, when the first gray light of dawn began to penetrate the frost-covered windows of his chamber, and worked longer into the evening by the light of oil lamps and candles. The cold made travel more difficult, but it also brought patients to his door who might otherwise have attempted to endure their ailments without professional care. One particularly memorable morning, as fresh snow fell silently outside his windows, Master Aldrich received an unexpected visitor. Brother Augustus, a traveling monk from the monastery of Saint Martin in the distant kingdom of France, arrived at the physician's door bearing letters and news from the wider world. The monk's face was drawn with exhaustion from his long journey, and his dark robes were still dusted with snow from the final miles of his pilgrimage. "Master Aldrich," the monk said, his voice hoarse from the cold, "I bring greetings from Brother Thomas of Marseille, who speaks most highly of your reputation for learning and skill. I come seeking not treatment for any ailment of the body, but rather knowledge that might serve the greater good of Christendom." Master Aldrich welcomed the monk into his warm shop and offered him wine and bread to restore his strength after the arduous journey. As Brother Augustus warmed himself by the small brazier that heated the physician's workspace, he spoke of disturbing reports that were spreading throughout the monasteries and universities of Europe. A terrible pestilence, unlike any disease known to medical science, was ravaging the great trading cities of the Mediterranean. In Genoa and Venice, in Marseille and Barcelona, the monk said, his voice heavy with concern, the death toll mounts with each passing day. Ships arrive in harbor with their crews already dead, their holds filled with goods from the east, but no living souls to tell the tale of their voyage. The disease strikes with the swiftness of a lightning bolt, and those who are afflicted rarely survive beyond a few days. Master Aldrich listened with growing interest as Brother Augustus described the symptoms that had been reported by physicians who had witnessed the pestilence firsthand: sudden fever, followed by the appearance of dark swellings in the neck, armpits, and groin. These bubonic manifestations, larger than any similar conditions known to medical literature, were accompanied by blackening of the extremities and often by severe mental confusion before death brought its merciful release. The physicians of Montpellier and Paris are baffled, the monk continued. Their usual remedies seem powerless against this enemy, and many learned doctors have themselves fallen victim to disease they sought to cure. Some speak of divine punishment for the sins of mankind, while others search for natural explanations in the movements of the planets and the corruption of the air. The conversation continued well into the afternoon, as Master Aldrich questioned the monk about every detail of the reports he had gathered during his travels. The physician's trained mind began to consider the implications of what he was hearing, comparing the described symptoms with various diseases documented in the medical literature he knew so well. Nothing in his education or experience provided a clear parallel to the pestilence that Brother Augustus described as evening approached. Master Aldrich offered the monk hospitality for the night, preparing a comfortable bed in the small guest chamber above his shop. The two men shared their evening meal with Dame Margaret and Master Thomas, and the monk's tales of distant lands and exotic customs provided entertainment that helped to lighten the darker aspects of his news. Brother Augustus had traveled extensively throughout Europe and the Holy Land, and his stories of Jerusalem, Constantinople, and the great universities of Paris and Bologna fascinated his listeners. That night, as snow continued to fall silently outside his window, the monk's report, trying to understand how such a devastating disease could spread so rapidly and resist the established methods of medical treatment. The classical texts that formed the foundation of his education offered no clear guidance for confronting a pestilence of such magnitude and virulence. The physician spent the sleepless hours reviewing everything he knew about the nature of epidemic disease. According to the medical wisdom of his time, such outbreaks were typically caused by corruption of the air, resulting from unfavorable combinations of planetary influences, volcanic emanations, or the stench arising from decaying matter. Once the air became corrupted with these harmful vapors, or miasmas, they could be inhaled by susceptible individuals, leading to the imbalance of humors that manifested as disease. But the pestilence described by Brother Augustus seemed to transcend these conventional explanations. Its rapid spread and devastating mortality suggested a malevolent force that operated according to principles not yet understood by medical science. Master Aldrich found himself wondering whether the accumulated wisdom of centuries might prove inadequate when confronted with this unprecedented challenge. Morning brought a break in the snowfall and the gradual return of normal activities to the city of Valdres. Brother Augustus departed after expressing his gratitude for the physician's hospitality, carrying with him letters that Master Aldrich had prepared for learned colleagues in other cities. The monk's visit had left the physician with much to contemplate, and he found it difficult to concentrate on his usual routine of patient care and remedy preparation in the days that followed. Master Aldrich began to notice subtle changes in the atmosphere of the city. Merchants who had traveled to distant trading centers spoke in hushed tones of unusual events. Ships arriving in port after unusually long voyages. Stories of cities that had suddenly ceased all communication with the outside world, and rumors of royal courts that had been forced to abandon their capitals due to mysterious illnesses. The Guild of Physicians held its monthly meeting in the great hall of the cathedral, and Master Aldrich was surprised to find that several of his colleagues had also received disturbing reports from various sources. Master Hugo, who maintained correspondence with physicians in Paris and London, spoke of learned doctors who had written of their helplessness in the face of an unknown disease. Master Bernard, recently returned from a pilgrimage to Rome, described the fear and confusion that gripped the papal court as reports of the approaching pestilence reached the Eternal City. "We must prepare ourselves," declared Master Stephen, the eldest and most respected member of the guild. "If this pestilence should reach our city, we shall need every resource at our disposal to protect our people and maintain order in the face of catastrophe. I propose that we begin immediately to accumulate stores of the remedies most likely to prove effective against epidemic disease." The assembled physicians agreed to coordinate their efforts, pooling their knowledge and resources to create a comprehensive response plan. Master Aldrich volunteered to research the classical texts for any references to similar diseases, while his colleagues undertook to gather information from their own networks of correspondence throughout Europe. The guild hall buzzed with urgent conversation as the physicians discussed the practical challenges they might face if the reported pestilence should indeed reach Val d'Ar as winter gradually gave way to spring. The flow of disturbing news increased with the resumption of trade and travel that warmer weather made possible. Merchants returning from the great commercial centers of Italy brought accounts of cities virtually depopulated by disease, of noble families wiped out within a matter of days, and of entire regions where normal life had ceased to function. The pestilence appeared to be advancing northward with the inexorable progress of an invading army, leaving devastation in its wake. Master Aldrich threw himself into his research with renewed intensity, spending long hours in the monastery library consulting every available text that might shed light on the nature of epidemic disease. The works of Galen and Avicenna, the commentaries of Maimonides and Albertus Magnus, the practical manuals of surgical procedure and pharmaceutical preparation, all were examined with meticulous care for any insight that might prove relevant to the approaching crisis. The physician also began to experiment with various prophylactic preparations, compounds that might be used to prevent disease rather than merely treat its symptoms after they appeared. Following the established medical theory that epidemic diseases were caused by corruption of the air, he developed aromatic mixtures designed to purify the atmosphere around those who used them. These preparations typically included powerful spices such as cinnamon and cloves, combined with medicinal herbs known for their ability to strengthen the body's natural defenses. As spring blossomed into early summer, the first definitive reports reached Valdres of the pestilence's arrival in the great port cities of the northern Mediterranean. Marseille, the closest major trading center to their region, had been struck with devastating effect. According to eyewitness accounts brought by fleeing refugees, the city's population had been reduced by more than half within a matter of weeks, and normal commerce had ground to a complete halt. The news sent shockwaves through Valdres, as the city's prosperity depended heavily on trade with Marseille and other Mediterranean ports. But more immediate than economic concerns was the recognition that the pestilence was now close enough to pose a direct threat to their own community. The refugees who brought the news might themselves be carriers of the disease, and the normal flow of merchants and travelers could bring the deadly contagion directly to their gates. Lord Geoffrey de Montfort called an emergency meeting of the city's leading citizens to address the crisis. The great hall of his castle, normally used for ceremonial occasions and the administration of justice, became the scene of urgent deliberations as the city's leaders struggled to develop an effective response to the unprecedented threat they faced. Master Aldrich found himself in the unusual position of being one of the most knowledgeable people in the room regarding the nature of the approaching danger. His research and his correspondence with physicians in affected areas had given him insights that proved invaluable to the city's decision-makers. He spoke with quiet authority about the symptoms and progression of the disease, the apparent methods by which it spread, and the limited options available for prevention and treatment. From all reports, the physician explained to the assembled nobles, clergy, and guildmasters, this pestilence strikes without regard for age, station, or previous condition of health. Neither wealth nor piety appears to offer protection, and the mortality rate among those afflicted approaches 9 cases out of every 10. Our primary hope lies in preventing the disease from entering our city, and in maintaining order and essential services should prevention prove impossible. The discussion that followed was both practical and philosophical, as the city's leaders grappled with decisions that would affect the lives and welfare of thousands of people. Should they close the city gates and refuse entry to all travelers, potentially condemning innocent refugees to death in the countryside while protecting their own citizens? Could they establish effective quarantine procedures that would allow essential trade to continue while minimizing the risk of contagion? How could they maintain civil order and prevent panic if the pestilence should indeed penetrate their defenses? Master Stephen, speaking for the Guild of Physicians, outlined the medical preparations they had made and requested additional resources to expand their efforts. The Guild had established emergency stocks of medicinal supplies and had developed protocols for treating large numbers of patients should the need arise. But they were brutally honest about the limitations of their capabilities in the face of a disease that had proved resistant to all conventional treatments. The meeting concluded with a series of practical decisions that would fundamentally alter life in Valdres for the foreseeable future. Guards would be stationed at all city gates to examine travelers and refuse entry to anyone showing signs of illness. Emergency hospitals would be established in buildings outside the city walls to care for any cases that might appear. The Guild of Physicians would be given extensive authority to implement whatever measures they deemed necessary for public health, including the power to impose quarantine restrictions on individuals or entire neighborhoods. As summer reached its peak, the city of Valdres began to resemble a fortress under siege. The usual flow of merchants and pilgrims slowed to a trickle as word spread of the strict entry procedures and the very real danger that the pestilence posed to travelers. Those who did seek entry were subjected to careful examination by Master Aldrich and his colleagues, a process that could take several days as potential symptoms were monitored before final approval was granted. The physician found his daily routine completely transformed by these new responsibilities. Instead of treating the familiar ailments of his established practice, he spent long hours examining travelers, supervising the emergency hospitals, and coordinating with his colleagues on the constantly evolving protocols designed to protect the city. The work was exhausting and stressful, made more difficult by the knowledge that despite all their precautions, they might ultimately prove powerless to prevent the catastrophe that had already engulfed so many other communities. Late one evening in mid-August, as Master Aldrich returned to his shop after another long day at the city gates, he paused to look out over the familiar streets of Valdres. The city appeared peaceful in the gathering dusk, its residents going about their normal activities with no outward sign of the tension and fear that had gripped the community for weeks. Children played in the narrow alleys between houses, women drew water from the public wells, and the evening air was filled with the sounds of normal urban life. But the physician knew that beneath this surface normality lay a current of anxiety that affected every person in the city. Families hoarded food and supplies against an uncertain future, while religious devotions intensified as people sought divine protection from the approaching danger. The usual patterns of social interaction had been subtly altered by the knowledge that any stranger might be a carrier of death, and the easy trust that had previously characterized relationships within the community had given way to a more cautious and fearful attitude toward outsiders. Master Aldrich climbed the stairs to his chamber with weary steps, his mind already turning to the challenges that tomorrow would bring. Intelligence reports suggested that the pestilence had now reached the major trading cities to the east and south of Valdres, making it virtually certain that they would soon face the very crisis they had worked so desperately to prevent. Chapter 3. The Dark Transformation. The first case appeared on a Tuesday morning in late August, when the summer heat lay heavy over the cobblestones of Valdres like a suffocating blanket. Master Aldrich was examining a merchant who sought entry to the city when he noticed the telltale signs that he had learned to recognize from the detailed reports of his colleagues in afflicted regions. The man's eyes held a particular glassy quality. His skin bore the faint flush of rising fever, and most ominous of all, he complained of severe pain in his neck and armpits. Within hours of this discovery, the merchant was dead, and Master Aldrich found himself staring down at the corpse of Valdris's first victim of the great pestilence. The swollen lymph nodes, or buboes as they came to be known, had developed with frightening rapidity, growing from barely noticeable lumps to grotesque protrusions the size of hen's eggs. The man's extremities had darkened to an alarming black color, and the stench that rose from the body was unlike anything in the physician's previous experience. Word of the death spread through the city with the speed of wildfire, despite Master Aldrich's attempts to maintain secrecy while he consulted with his colleagues. By evening, panic had begun to grip the population of Valdris, and the physician found himself at the center of a crisis that would test every aspect of his training, his courage, and his fundamental understanding of the nature of disease and healing. Lord Geoffrey immediately implemented the emergency protocols that had been developed during the months of preparation. The city gates were sealed completely, allowing no one to enter or leave, while guards were stationed at regular intervals throughout the streets to maintain order and prevent the kind of civil breakdown that had been reported in other afflicted cities. The emergency hospitals outside the walls were activated, and Master Aldrich found himself appointed as the chief medical officer, responsible for coordinating the city's response to the pestilence. The transformation in the Fayouche physician's daily routine was immediate and dramatic. Instead of the quiet contemplation of individual cases that had characterized his previous practice, he now found himself managing a growing crisis that threatened to overwhelm every resource at his disposal. Patients began arriving at the emergency hospitals in increasing numbers, and each new case confirmed the devastating nature of the disease they were facing. Master Aldrich quickly realized that the conventional treatments he had learned during his university years were utterly inadequate for dealing with this unprecedented medical emergency. Bloodletting, the mainstay of medieval therapeutic practice, seemed only to weaken patients who were already fighting for their lives. The various herbal preparations and mineral compounds that formed his normal pharmacopoeia proved equally ineffective against the relentless progression of the disease. Faced with the complete failure of established medical methods, the physician found himself forced to improvise new approaches based on careful observation of the disease's symptoms and progression. He began to experiment with different combinations of medicinal herbs, seeking substances that might at least provide comfort to the suffering, even if they could not effect a cure. Poppy extract proved valuable for managing the severe pain that accompanied the development of buboes, while cooling herbs helped to reduce the raging fevers that consumed patients in the final stages of their illness. But perhaps the most difficult aspect of Master Aldrich's new role was the necessity of protecting himself and his assistants from the contagion while still providing care to those who needed it. The classical medical texts contained scattered references to the use of aromatic substances and protective clothing during times of epidemic disease, but these recommendations had been developed for less virulent conditions and proved inadequate for the current crisis. Working with Master Edmund, the city's most skilled leather craftsman, Master Aldrich began to design specialized protective garments that would allow medical personnel to work safely among the infected. The result was a distinctive and somewhat frightening costume that would become forever associated with the plague physicians of the medieval period. The foundation was a long coat made of heavy waxed leather, treated with aromatic substances believed to repel the corrupted air that carried the pestilence. The most memorable feature of this protective ensemble was the beaked mask that covered the physician's entire head. The long bird-like protrusion contained a mixture of aromatic herbs and spices cinnamon, cloves, rosemary, and thyme that were believed to purify the air before it reached the wearer's lungs. Glass eyepieces provided vision while maintaining a barrier against contamination, and the entire mask was designed to fit tightly against the head to prevent any corrupted air from seeping around the edges. Thick leather gloves extended well up the arms, while high boots provided protection for the feet and lower legs. A wide-brimmed hat completed the ensemble, serving both to identify the wearer as a medical professional and to provide additional protection from airborne contagion. In one hand, the plague physician carried a long wooden cane that allowed him to examine patients and direct their movements, without direct physical contact. The first time Master Aldrich donned this complete protective costume, he was struck by how it transformed not only his appearance but his entire relationship with the world around him. The restrictive mask made breathing difficult and communication nearly impossible, while the heavy leather garments limited his mobility and dexterity. Most disturbingly, he realized that his appearance had become thoroughly frightening to the very patients he sought to help, resembling more some supernatural harbinger of doom than a healer committed to the preservation of life. Yet despite its limitations and the fear it inspired, the protective costume did appear to offer some measure of safety to those who wore it properly. Master Aldrich and his assistants were able to work among infected patients for extended periods, without themselves succumbing to the disease, a notable contrast to the experience of physicians in other cities who had attempted to continue their normal practice without special precautions. The daily routine of a plague physician bore little resemblance to the measured pace of normal medical practice. Master Aldrich's day began before dawn with the grim task of recording and disposing of those who had died during the night. The bodies had to be handled with extreme care to prevent further spread of contagion, wrapped in specially prepared shrouds and removed for burial in the mass graves that had been established outside the city walls. After completing these melancholy duties, the physician would make his rounds among the living patients, examining new arrivals and checking on the progress of those already under care. The examination process had been streamlined by necessity, focusing on the most essential observations that could help determine prognosis and guide whatever limited treatment options were available. The vast majority of patients followed a depressingly similar pattern of decline. The disease typically announced itself with sudden onset of high fever, severe headache, and extreme fatigue that left victims barely able to stand. Within 24 hours, the characteristic buboes would begin to appear, usually starting in the neck and armpits before spreading to the groin and other areas where lymph nodes were concentrated. As the disease progressed, patients often developed dark patches on their skin, beginning with the extremities and gradually spreading toward the torso. Delirium and confusion became common as the fever mounted, and many patients spent their final hours in a state of agitated unconsciousness, their bodies fighting a battle they were almost certainly destined to lose. Master Aldrich estimated that fewer than one patient in 10 survived the full course of the disease, and even these rare survivors often faced permanent disabilities from the damage the pestilence had inflicted on their bodies. The buboes sometimes ruptured and drained, providing temporary relief but leaving painful wounds that healed slowly and imperfectly. Many survivors found that their strength and endurance had been permanently reduced, making it difficult for them to return to their previous occupations and normal lives. The emotional toll of witnessing such suffering on a daily basis was enormous, and Master Aldrich found himself struggling to maintain the professional composure that had always characterized his approach to medical practice. The sheer scale of death and suffering that surrounded him seemed to exceed the capacity of any individual mind to comprehend and process. Sleep became fitful and haunted by dreams of the patients he had been unable to save, while waking hours brought the constant awareness that his own life hung by the slenderest of threads despite his protective precautions. The social fabric of Valdres began to unravel under the pressure of the ongoing crisis. Families were torn apart as some members succumbed to the disease while others remained healthy, creating survivors who faced not only grief but also the practical challenges of managing property and responsibilities they had never expected to inherit. Children orphaned by the pestilence wandered the streets in growing numbers, while elderly residents who had lost their adult children faced destitution and abandonment. Trade and commerce, the lifeblood of the city's prosperity, ground to a virtual halt as the quarantine restrictions and the fear of contagion made normal business relationships impossible to maintain. Food shortages began to develop as the rural areas surrounding Valdres were also affected by the spreading pestilence, and the city's leaders found themselves facing the dual challenge of medical crisis and potential social collapse. Religious life in the city underwent its own transformation as the cathedral clergy struggled to provide spiritual comfort to a population facing unprecedented mortality. The traditional funeral rites became impossible to perform when deaths numbered in the dozens daily, and mass burial sites replaced the individual graves that had previously honored each departed soul. Some residents found their faith strengthened by the crisis, viewing their sufferings as a test of divine will that must be endured with patience and hope. Others questioned how a benevolent God could permit such widespread devastation of innocent people. Master Aldrich found his own faith both tested and deepened by his daily confrontation with the mystery of suffering and death. The complete failure of medical science to provide effective treatment for the pestilence forced him to acknowledge the limitations of human knowledge and the ultimate dependence of all healing on forces beyond mortal understanding. Yet the opportunity to provide comfort and dignity to dying patients, even when cure was impossible, seemed to reveal new dimensions of his calling as a physician. In the quiet moments between the profane, endless demands of patient care, Master Aldrich began to document his observations of the disease and his attempts to develop effective treatments. These written records, maintained despite the overwhelming pressures of the crisis, would provide valuable information for future physicians who might face similar challenges. He wrote not only of medical symptoms and therapeutic approaches, but also of the human dimensions of the epidemic, the courage and selflessness he witnessed among his assistants, the dignity with which many patients faced their final hours, and the small acts of kindness that continued to flourish, even in the midst of catastrophe. The protective costume that had initially seemed so alien and frightening gradually became as familiar as his normal physician's robes had once been. Master Aldrich learned to move efficiently despite the cumbersome leather garments, to communicate clearly through the muffling mask, and to conduct examinations using the long wooden cane that maintained necessary distance from infected patients. What had begun as an improvised response to immediate danger evolved into a systematic approach to medical practice under extreme conditions. As autumn approached, and the pestilence continued its relentless advance through the population of Valdres, Master Aldrich reflected on how completely his life and identity had been transformed by the crisis. The quiet scholar who had once spent his days in contemplative study of ancient medical texts had become something entirely different, a warrior in a desperate battle against an implacable enemy, a guide for the dying, a symbol of hope in circumstances that seemed utterly hopeless. The familiar routines of his former practice now seemed to belong to another world, a peaceful realm of manageable ailments and reliable cures that had been swept away by forces beyond anyone's ability to control or predict. In their place had emerged a new kind of medical practice, one that emphasized comfort over cure, dignity over healing, and the courage to continue serving humanity even when success by conventional measures had become impossible. The leather-clad figure that Master Aldrich had become would soon be recognized throughout Europe as the iconic image of the plague physician, a symbol both terrifying and reassuring of medicine's attempt to confront the greatest health crisis in human history. Behind the beaked mask and protective garments was still the same man who had once mixed herbal remedies in his peaceful shop on Healer's Lane. But that man had been tested and transformed by circumstances that would have been unimaginable in the comfortable world he had once inhabited. As the first winter of the pestilence approached, Master Aldrich prepared himself and his remaining assistants for what would likely be months of continued crisis. The disease showed no signs of abating, and intelligence reports suggested that it would continue to spread throughout Europe for years to come. The protective costume that had been improvised from necessity would become the standard garment of plague physicians across the continent, while the methods of patient care and infection control that he had developed through desperate experimentation would be adopted by medical practitioners facing similar challenges in cities and towns throughout the known world. Chapter 4. The Healing Arts in Darkness. The winter months brought a temporary respite from new cases, as the cold weather seemed to slow the spread of the pestilence through the decimated population of Valdres. Master Aldrich used this breathing space to reflect on everything he had learned during the terrible months since the disease first appeared in their city. The emergency hospitals that had been hastily constructed outside the walls now housed fewer patients, but those who remained faced the additional hardship of healing from their wounds in the bitter cold of an unusually harsh winter. The physician's daily rounds took him through wards filled with survivors who bore the permanent marks of their encounter with the great pestilence. Some displayed the scarred remains of buboes that had ruptured and drained during the acute phase of their illness, while others struggled with the weakness and fatigue that seemed to persist long after the fever had broken. Master Aldrich had become skilled in managing these chronic conditions, developing new approaches to rehabilitation that helped survivors gradually rebuild their strength and return to productive lives. Working by candlelight in his makeshift laboratory within the emergency hospital, Master Aldrich continued his experiments with various medicinal preparations that might prove useful in treating the lingering effects of the disease. He had discovered that certain combinations of restorative herbs seemed particularly effective in helping survivors regain their appetite and energy, while other substances showed promise in promoting the healing of the stubborn wounds that often marked the sites where buboes had appeared. The protective costume that had become his daily uniform throughout the crisis was gradually modified and refined based on practical experience. Master Aldrich worked with the leather craftsmen of Valdres to develop improved versions that provided better protection, while allowing greater mobility and clearer communication. The aromatic substances packed within the beak-like mask were adjusted based on his observations of which combinations seemed most effective in maintaining the health of medical personnel. These winter months also provided an opportunity for Master Aldrich to document his experiences in greater detail, creating a comprehensive record of the pestilence and the medical response it had required. Working by the light of oil lamps in his quarters above the hospital, he wrote detailed descriptions of symptoms, treatment protocols, and patient outcomes that would serve as a guide for future physicians who might face similar challenges. His writing captured not only the medical aspects of the crisis, but also the human dimensions that had been so deeply moving to witness. He described the courage of the hospital attendants who had volunteered to care for infected patients despite the obvious danger to their own lives. He wrote of families who had maintained their love and devotion even as the disease claimed multiple members, and of the community leaders who had worked tirelessly to maintain essential services throughout the emergency. Most poignantly, Master Aldrich documented the stories of individual patients who had made particularly strong impressions during their treatment. Young Isabella, the baker's daughter, who had survived the disease but lost her sight, yet maintained an optimistic spirit that inspired everyone who met her. Master Giovanni, the elderly scholar, who had used his final days to dictate a treatise on theology to one of the hospital scribes, creating a work of lasting value even as his life drew to its close. These personal accounts revealed the profound impact that the pestilence had made not only on the city's population, but on Master Aldrich himself. The physician who had once viewed his practice primarily in terms of technical skill and scholarly knowledge, had discovered dimensions of healing that extended far beyond the physical restoration of health. The simple act of presence, of remaining with patients during their darkest hours, had proved to be as valuable as any medicinal preparation in providing comfort and hope that, as spring returned to Valdres, bringing with it the resumption of trade and communication with the outside world, Master Aldrich learned that similar transformations had occurred throughout Europe. Physicians in Paris and London, in Barcelona and Vienna, had developed their own versions of protective clothing and modified their practices to meet the unprecedented challenges of the Great Pestilence. Letters from medical colleagues described experiences remarkably similar to those he had documented in Valdres, suggesting that the plague had forced the entire medical profession to confront the limits of established knowledge and develop new approaches to healing. The fame of the plague physicians and their distinctive costumes had spread throughout Europe, creating both admiration and fear among the general population. To some, the leather-clad figures represented hope and expertise in the face of medical crisis. To others, their appearance had become so associated with death and suffering that they were viewed as harbingers of doom whose arrival in any community signaled impending disaster. Master Aldrich received invitations from several major cities to travel and share his expertise with physicians who were still struggling to develop effective responses to ongoing outbreaks. The University of Paris offered him a position teaching the new methods of epidemic medicine that had emerged from the crisis, while Lord Geoffrey sought to retain his services as the chief medical officer of Valdres for the challenges that lay ahead. The decision was difficult, as each option offered unique opportunities for service and advancement. Ultimately, Master Aldrich chose to remain in Valdres, feeling a deep obligation to continue serving the community that had supported him through the crisis and to maintain the medical infrastructure they had built together. The emergency hospitals were converted into permanent medical facilities that could respond quickly to any future outbreaks, while the protocols developed during the pestilence became the foundation for ongoing public health programs. The summer of the second year brought scattered reports of new outbreaks in distant regions, confirming that the Great Pestilence had not been conquered, but merely contained in certain areas. Master Aldrich used these reports to refine his understanding of the disease's patterns and to improve the preparedness measures that might prevent future catastrophes in Valdres. The protective costume that had once seemed so strange and frightening was now accepted as a normal tool of medical practice, worn not only during epidemic conditions, but also when treating any patient with symptoms that might suggest contagious disease. The Guild of Physicians formally adopted the new protocols that had emerged from the crisis, creating standardized training programs that would ensure future doctors possess the knowledge and skills necessary to respond effectively to epidemic conditions. Master Aldrich found himself appointed as the Guild's chief instructor in epidemic medicine, responsible for teaching the hard-won lessons of the pestilence years to a new generation of medical practitioners. These teaching duties brought a new dimension of satisfaction to Master Aldrich's professional life, as he was able to pass on not only the technical knowledge he had acquired, but also the deeper understanding of medical calling that the crisis had revealed. His students learned to prepare and use the protective costume, to recognize the early symptoms of epidemic disease, and to manage the psychological challenges of medical practice under extreme conditions. But perhaps most importantly, they learned that the true measure of a physician's worth was not the percentage of patients cured or the complexity of treatments prescribed, but the willingness to remain present and engaged even when conventional healing was impossible. The plague physician's role as companion to the dying, as witness to suffering, and as symbol of human compassion in the face of overwhelming adversity became recognized as an essential aspect of medical practice. The workshops where the protective costumes were manufactured became centers of specialized craftsmanship, as leather workers, cloth merchants, and spice dealers collaborated to produce garments that met the exacting standards developed through practical experience. The long beaked masks were carefully shaped and fitted, while the aromatic mixtures packed within were prepared according to formulas that Master Aldrich had perfected through months of experimentation. Each complete costume represented a significant investment of time and materials, making these specialized garments available only to established physicians and certified medical institutions. The visual impact of the costume had become so powerful that strict regulations were developed to prevent unauthorized individuals from obtaining or wearing the distinctive garments, ensuring that the appearance of a plague physician genuinely indicated the presence of trained medical personnel. As the third year since the first appearance of the pestilence began, Master Aldrich reflected on how completely his understanding of medical practice had been transformed by the crisis. The confident young physician who had once believed that proper application of classical medical theory can address any health challenge had been replaced by a more humble practitioner who understood that healing often required as much art as science, as much courage as knowledge. The protective costume that he still wore during his rounds had become like a second skin, so familiar that he barely noticed its weight and restrictions. The long wooden cane that maintained distance between physician and patient had become an extension of his diagnostic abilities, while the beaked mask that had once seemed so alien now felt like a natural part of his professional identity. The people of Valdres had grown accustomed to the sight of their plague physician making his daily rounds, and children who had once fled in terror from his frightening appearance now greeted him with waves and smiles. The costume that had been designed to inspire fear and maintain distance had, paradoxically, become a symbol of comfort and reassurance, representing the community's confidence that they were prepared to face whatever medical challenges the future might bring. Master Aldrich's reputation had spread far beyond the boundaries of Valdres, and he regularly received visitors from other cities seeking to learn from his experiences and adopt his methods. These consultations provided opportunities to refine and improve the techniques that had been developed during the crisis, as different communities had discovered their own innovations and adaptations that could benefit the broader medical community. The written records that Master Aldrich had maintained throughout the pestilence years had grown into a comprehensive manual of epidemic medicine that was copied and distributed to medical institutions throughout Europe. His detailed observations of disease progression, treatment outcomes, and administrative challenges provided invaluable guidance for physicians and civic leaders who face similar crises in their own communities. But beyond the technical knowledge contained in these documents, Master Aldrich's writings captured the profound human dimensions of epidemic disease and medical response. His accounts of individual courage and community solidarity, of the discovery of new sources of meaning and purpose in the midst of catastrophe, offered inspiration and guidance that transcended the specifics of medical practice. The transformation of medieval medicine that had begun with the Great Pestilence continued to evolve as new challenges and opportunities emerged. The plague physician, with his distinctive costume and specialized training, had become a permanent fixture of the medical landscape, ready to respond whenever epidemic disease threatened the health and stability of European communities. Master Aldrich's role in this transformation had been both professional and personal, as the young scholar who had once pursued knowledge for its own sake had discovered that the highest calling of medicine lay in service to human suffering, regardless of the prospects for successful treatment. The beaked mask and leather garments that had once seemed so strange and frightening had become symbols of dedication and compassion, representing medicine's commitment to remain present and engaged even in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. Chapter 5. The Long Shadow of Memory. As the years passed and the immediate crisis of the Great Pestilence gradually faded into memory, Master Aldrich found his life settling into new patterns that bore little resemblance to the quiet scholarly routine he had once known. The physician who had emerged from the crucible of epidemic disease was a different man entirely, shaped by experiences that had tested every aspect of his character and calling. The protective costume that had once been an emergency improvisation had become the symbol of a new kind of medical practice, one that acknowledged both the possibilities and limitations of human healing arts. The city of Valdres bore its own scars from the years of crisis, visible in the empty houses that had once sheltered families claimed by the pestilence, the mass burial grounds that served as somber reminders of mortality's swift advance, and the changed relationships among survivors who had witnessed humanity at both its best and worst. Yet the community had also been strengthened by shared suffering and mutual support, creating bonds of solidarity that transcended the traditional boundaries of class and occupation. Master Aldrich's daily rounds now encompassed not only the remaining survivors of the original outbreak, but also a steady stream of new patients who sought treatment for the various ailments that had always afflicted human beings. His reputation as a plague physician had made him famous throughout the region, drawing patients from distant towns and villages who believed that someone who had successfully confronted the Great Pestilence must possess unusual healing powers. The reality was both more complex and more humble than his reputation suggested. Master Aldrich had learned that medicine's greatest victories often came not from dramatic cures, but from the patient application of small comforts that eased suffering and provided hope during dark times. The techniques he had developed for managing pain, supporting nutrition, and maintaining dignity during illness proved valuable for many conditions beyond epidemic disease. The workshops where protective costumes were manufactured had evolved into centers of medical innovation, as craftsmen worked with physicians to develop improved instruments and equipment for various medical purposes. The long wooden canes used by plague physicians had inspired the creation of other diagnostic tools that allowed examination from a safe distance, while the aromatic preparations originally designed to purify corrupted air found new applications in treating respiratory ailments and promoting general health. Master Aldrich's writings on epidemic medicine had been copied and distributed throughout Europe, making him one of the most influential medical authors of his generation. Universities across the continent invited him to lecture on his experiences, and his treatise on the protective costume and its proper use became required reading for students preparing to enter medical practice. The knowledge that had been gained through desperate improvisation during the crisis was being systematized into formal medical education. Yet with fame and influence came new responsibilities that sometimes felt as burdensome as the original crisis had been. Master Aldrich found himself called upon to advise civic leaders on public health measures, to train new generations of plague physicians, and to serve as a consultant whenever reports of suspicious diseases appeared in distant regions. The quiet contemplation that had once characterized his scholarly pursuits was replaced by constant demands for action and decision. The protective costume that had become his professional trademark was now worn not only during medical emergencies, but also during ceremonial occasions and formal consultations. The leather garments that had once seemed so cumbersome had been refined and improved until they allowed considerable freedom of movement, while the beaked mask had been modified to permit clearer speech and better vision without compromising its protective functions. Children who had grown up during the pestilence years no longer found the costume frightening but rather reassuring, associating its appearance with safety and professional competence. Parents would point out the plague physician during his rounds, explaining to their offspring that this imposing figure represented their community's preparation for whatever medical challenges might arise in the future. The psychological impact of wearing such a distinctive and symbolic costume had been profound. For Master Aldrich himself, the anonymous scholar who had once blended invisibly into the crowds of medieval Valdres had become an instantly recognizable public figure whose appearance commanded both respect and attention. The costume served as both protection and burden, providing professional authority while also creating expectations that sometimes felt overwhelming. In quiet moments, usually late at night when the demands of practice and teaching had finally subsided, Master Aldrich would reflect on the journey that had brought him from peaceful academic pursuits to his boy's current role as a symbol of medical dedication. The transformation had been neither sought nor anticipated, arising instead from circumstances that had demanded responses beyond anything his education had prepared him to provide. The students who now sought his guidance came not only to learn the technical aspects of epidemic medicine, but also to understand how one maintained courage and compassion in the face of seemingly hopeless situations. Master Aldrich found these conversations among the most meaningful aspects of his current work, as they allowed him to explore the deeper philosophical questions that the plague years had raised about the nature of healing and the responsibilities of those called to medical practice. Remember, he would tell his students as they practiced donning and adjusting the protective costume, this garment does not make you invulnerable to disease or suffering. It merely provides you with the means to remain present and engaged when others might be forced to flee. The true protection comes not from leather and herbs, but from dedication to service regardless of personal cost. The young physicians, who trained under Master Aldrich, carried his teachings to medical practices throughout Europe, spreading not only the technical innovations developed during the plague years but also the philosophical approach that had emerged from confronting medical impossibility with unwavering commitment. The costume became a symbol not just of epidemic preparedness, but of medicine's refusal to abandon patients, even when cure was beyond reach. As Master Aldrich entered the later years of his career, he began to consider how the lessons learned during the Great Pestilence might be preserved for future generations who would face their own medical crises. The written records he had maintained provided detailed documentation of specific techniques and procedures, but the deeper wisdom gained through the experience seemed more difficult to capture in words. The decision to establish a permanent School of Epidemic Medicine in Valdres represented Master Aldrich's attempt to create an institution that would embody the values and approaches that had proven most essential during the plague years. Students would come not only to learn protective techniques and treatment protocols, but also to develop the mental and spiritual resources necessary for confronting human suffering with dignity and hope. The school's curriculum included not only medical subjects but also philosophy, theology, and the practical arts of administration and leadership that proved crucial during times of community crisis. Students learned to view their calling as encompassing not just individual patient care, but also public health, social stability, and the preservation of human values under extreme stress. The protective costume that had once been an improvised response to immediate danger became the ceremonial garb worn by graduates of the school, marking their commitment to serve wherever epidemic disease threatened human welfare. The sight of these distinctively dressed physicians became common throughout Europe as communities sought to prepare themselves for future medical emergencies. Master Aldrich's influence extended beyond medical practice into the broader cultural understanding of disease, healing, and human responsibility. The figure of the plague physician, with its combination of scientific knowledge and selfless dedication, became embedded in the medieval imagination as a symbol of humanity's ongoing struggle against the forces that threatened life and health. Artists began to include plague physicians in their depictions of medical scenes, while poets wrote verses celebrating the courage of those who confronted epidemic disease. The costume that had been designed for purely practical purposes became an icon of medical dedication, inspiring respect and gratitude rather than the fear it had initially generated. As reports of new disease outbreaks reached Valdres from distant regions, Master Aldrich would prepare his advanced students for deployment to affected areas, sending them forth equipped not only with protective costumes and medical supplies, but also with the philosophical preparation necessary to maintain hope and effectiveness under extreme conditions. These missions served both to provide assistance to communities in need and to ensure that each new generation of plague physicians gained this practical experience necessary to carry forward the tradition. The letters that arrived from his former students working in plague-stricken areas provided Master Aldrich with deep satisfaction, as they described successful applications of the techniques and approaches he had taught them. More importantly, they conveyed the sense of purpose and meaning that came from serving others during their greatest time of need, confirming that the values central to epidemic medicine were being successfully transmitted to new generations. The legacy of the Great Pestilence continued to shape Master Aldrich's daily life and work as he advanced into his final years of active practice. The protective costume that had once seemed so alien had become as familiar as his own skin, while the techniques developed during those desperate months had evolved into systematic methods that were being taught throughout Europe. Yet perhaps the most important legacy was not technical but human, the understanding that medicine's highest calling lay not in the conquest of disease, but in the faithful presence with those who suffered, the commitment to serve regardless of outcome, and the recognition that healing encompassed far more than the restoration of physical health. These insights, born from the crucible of epidemic crisis, would continue to influence medical practice long after the last plague physician had set aside his beaked mask and leather garments. As Master Aldrich prepared to pass the leadership of his school to younger hands, he reflected on how the terrifying years of the Great Pestilence had ultimately revealed new dimensions of human possibility and professional dedication. The costume that had been improvised from necessity had become a symbol of medicine's commitment to serve humanity under any circumstances, while the man who wore it had discovered that the deepest satisfaction of medical practice came not from successful cures, but from faithful service in the face of impossible challenges. The peaceful evening light that streamed through the windows of his study carried memories of countless patients whose faces had been glimpsed through the glass eyepieces of his protective mask, each one representing a moment when human compassion had confronted suffering and refused to turn away. In their collective memory, the true meaning of the plague physician's calling was preserved, a testament to the enduring power of dedication and service that transcended the boundaries of life and death. Chapter 6. The eternal vigil. In the quiet twilight of his distinguished career, Master Aldrich often found himself standing at the window of his study, gazing out over the cobblestone streets of Valdres as evening shadows lengthened and the familiar sounds of the city settling into rest drifted through the cool air. The town had grown and prospered in the years since the Great Pestilence, its population swelled by refugees from less fortunate communities and merchants drawn by the reputation for safety and medical expertise that the city had earned through its successful management of the crisis. The School of Epidemic Medicine that Master Aldrich had established had become one of the most prestigious medical institutions in Europe, drawing students from as far away as Scotland and Sicily to learn the techniques and philosophy that had emerged from Valdres's confrontation with the plague. The distinctive protective costumes worn by the school's graduates had become a familiar sight throughout the continent, symbols of medical dedication that commanded respect and gratitude wherever they appeared. Master Aldrich's own costume, worn smooth by decades of use and care, hung in its accustomed place in his private chambers, like the regalia of some ancient and honorable office. The leather had softened with age and use, conforming to his body's contours until it felt like a second skin, while the beaked mask had been adjusted and refined countless times to achieve perfect comfort and function. Even in retirement, he occasionally donned a complete ensemble when consulted on particularly challenging cases or when demonstrating proper techniques to visiting physicians. The written chronicles that Master Aldrich had maintained throughout his career had grown into a comprehensive library of epidemic medicine, documenting not only the technical aspects of disease management but also the human stories that revealed the deeper meaning of medical calling. These volumes were consulted by scholars and practitioners throughout Europe, providing both practical guidance and philosophical inspiration for those who face similar challenges in their own communities. Among the most treasured of these records were the personal accounts of individual patients who had made particularly strong impressions during their treatment. Master Aldrich had documented not only their medical symptoms and responses to treatment, but also their courage, dignity, and the small acts of kindness that had illuminated even the darkest moments of the crisis. These stories serve to remind future physicians that behind every case was a unique human being deserving of respect and compassion. The impact of Master Aldrich's work extended far beyond the boundaries of medical practice into the broader understanding of human responsibility during times of crisis. The example set by the plague physicians had influenced civic leaders, religious authorities, and ordinary citizens to maintain higher standards of service and dedication when confronted with challenges that seemed to exceed human capacity to address effectively. The costume that had once been viewed with fear and suspicion had become a symbol of hope and professional competence, welcomed by communities that understood its significance as a sign of preparedness and dedication. Children who had grown up seeing plague physicians during routine medical visits no longer found the distinctive garb frightening but rather reassuring, associating its appearance with safety and expert care. As Master Aldrich reviewed the letters and reports that continued to arrive from his former students working throughout Europe, he found deep satisfaction in the knowledge that the lessons learned during Valdres's darkest hours were continuing to save lives and preserve human dignity in communities facing their own medical challenges. Each successful response to disease outbreak represented not merely a technical victory, but a triumph of human compassion over the forces that threatened to reduce people to statistics in the ledgers of mortality. The evening routine that had sustained Master Aldrich through decades of practice continued unchanged even as his active responsibilities gradually shifted to younger hands. He would spend the hour before sunset reviewing the day's medical reports, updating the comprehensive records that had become an invaluable resource for the international community of plague physicians, and preparing materials for the next day's teaching activities at the school. As darkness settled over Valdres and the cathedral bells chimed the final prayers of the day, Master Aldrich would often don his protective costume one more time, not from necessity, but from a desire to maintain connection with the calling that had defined his adult life. The familiar weight of the leather garments and the restrictive embrace of the beaked mask served as reminders of all the nights when such protection had been essential for survival, when the boundary between healer and patient had been measured in the thickness of waxed hide and the potency of aromatic herbs. Walking slowly through the quiet streets of the city, Master Aldrich would visit the sites that held particular significance in his personal journey from scholarly physician to legendary plague doctor. The location where the first victim had been discovered, now marked by a small shrine maintained by grateful citizens. The building that had served as the original emergency hospital, converted into a permanent medical facility that continued to serve the community's needs. The workshop where the first protective costumes had been crafted, now expanded into a facility that supplied similar garments to physicians throughout Europe. Each of these places held memories that had shaped not only Master Aldrich's understanding of medical practice, but also his comprehension of human nature under extreme stress. He had witnessed acts of selfless courage that challenged every assumption about the limits of individual dedication, while also observing the breakdown of social bonds that occurred when fear overwhelmed reason and compassion. The lessons learned from both extremes had informed his teaching and his writing, providing future physicians with realistic expectations about the challenges they might face. The school's dormitories housed students from across the known world, young men and women who had traveled vast distances to learn the techniques that had been developed in Valdres during the plague years. Master Aldrich took particular pleasure in the evening discussions that occurred in the school's common room, where students from different regions shared their observations about medical practices in their homeland and debated the philosophical questions that arose from confronting human mortality on a professional basis. These conversations often continued well into the night, as the students explored not only the technical aspects of epidemic medicine, but also the broader questions about the meaning of suffering, the responsibilities of healers, and the relationship between individual service and community welfare. Master Aldrich would listen more than he spoke during these sessions, allowing the younger minds to wrestle with concepts that had taken him decades to understand fully. The protective costumes worn by the students during their practical training had been refined and improved over the years, incorporating innovations suggested by graduates working in various parts of Europe. The basic design remained unchanged: the long leather coat, the beaked mask with its aromatic contents, the wide-brimmed hat and wooden cane. But countless small modifications had enhanced both protection and functionality. Each graduating class contributed some new improvement that was then incorporated into the standard design. Master Aldrich's reputation as the foremost authority on epidemic medicine brought him correspondence from physicians, civic leaders, and scholars throughout the civilized world. These letters sought not only technical advice about disease management, but also guidance on the broader challenges of maintaining social order and human values during times of extreme crisis. His responses, carefully composed during the quiet hours of early morning, formed an extensive body of wisdom, literature that was copied and preserved in libraries. From London to Constantinople, the financial success of the school and the demand for consultation services had made Master Aldrich one of the wealthiest citizens of Valdres. But he had chosen to live with the same modest simplicity that had characterized his life before fame and prosperity arrived. His personal quarters remained furnished with basic necessities, while most of his wealth was devoted to supporting the school's operations and providing assistance to communities that could not afford the services of trained plague physicians. The legacy that Master Aldrich was most conscious of creating was not material but intellectual and spiritual, the preservation and transmission of the insights about medical calling that had emerged from the crucible of epidemic disease. The young physicians who graduated from his school carried with them not only protective costumes and treatment protocols, but also understanding of medicine as a form of ministry to human suffering that transcended the boundaries of successful cure. As the years advanced, and Master Aldrich began to contemplate the eventual end of his earthly service, he found himself reflecting more frequently on the mystery of how individual lives became woven into larger patterns of meaning and significance. The quiet scholar who had once prepared herbal remedies in a peaceful shop had become a symbol recognized throughout Europe, but the transformation had occurred through circumstances that seemed to operate according to a logic beyond human planning or control. The protective costume that hung in his chamber bore the marks of decades of faithful, service-worn patches where the leather had been stressed by repeated use, carefully mended tears that spoke of close encounters with dangerous situations, and the subtle softening that came from countless hours of wear. Each mark told a story of dedication, and service that had extended far beyond the original crisis that had necessitated the costume's creation. The evening prayers that concluded each day had evolved over the years to include gratitude not only for personal safety and successful treatment of patients, but also for the privilege of serving as a vessel through which ancient healing traditions could be adapted to meet unprecedented challenges. Master Aldrich had come to understand his role as part of a continuous chain of medical dedication that stretched back to the earliest healers and would continue long after his own contribution had been completed. The students who would soon assume leadership of the school and the broader plague physician community represented not merely technical successors, but spiritual heirs to a tradition that valued presence and compassion as highly as knowledge and skill. Their commitment to serving wherever epidemic disease threatened human welfare would ensure that the lessons learned during Valdris's confrontation with the great pestilence would continue to benefit communities facing similar challenges. The written records that Master Aldrich had maintained throughout his career would serve future generations not only as practical manuals of epidemic medicine, but also as testimony to the possibility of finding meaning and purpose in the midst of circumstances that seem to deny all hope. The careful documentation of individual cases, treatment outcomes, and administrative challenges would provide invaluable guidance for physicians who might face similar crises in years to come. But beyond the technical information contained in these volumes lay a deeper message about the nature of healing and the responsibilities of those called to medical service. The accounts of patients who had maintained dignity and courage in the face of mortal illness, of families who had supported each other through unimaginable loss, and of communities that had discovered new sources of strength during times of crisis offered inspiration that transcended the specifics of epidemic disease. The protective costume had become more than a practical tool for Master Aldrich. It had evolved into a symbol of commitment and entity that connected him to every physician who had chosen to serve humanity during its darkest hours. When he donned the leather garments and adjusted the beaked mask, he was not merely preparing for medical duties, but affirming his place in a tradition of service that honored the sacred nature of healing. Work the quiet moments that Master Aldrich spent in contemplation, usually in the pre-dawn hours when the city still slept and his mind was most clear, were devoted increasingly to consideration of how the insights gained through his unusual career might be preserved and transmitted to future generations. The technical aspects of epidemic medicine could be taught through formal instruction, but the deeper understanding of medical calling required something more personal and transformative. The legacy that Master Aldrich hoped to leave was embodied not in buildings or books, but in the lives and service of the physicians who would learn from his example and would carry forward his commitment to remain present with those who suffered, regardless of the prospects for successful treatment. In their faithful service, the true meaning of the plague physicians' calling would be preserved and renewed for each generation that faced the ancient challenge of human mortality and the healing art's response to suffering. As the peaceful evening settled over Valdris and Master Aldrich prepared for another night's rest, he carried with him the satisfaction that comes from a life devoted to service that transcends individual achievement. The beaked mask and leather garments that had once seemed so strange and frightening had become symbols of hope and dedication, representing medicine's commitment to serve humanity under any circumstances, and the enduring power of compassion to illuminate even the darkest hours of human experience. Bells of the cathedral mocked the passage of time with their familiar bronze voices, reminding all who heard them of the eternal rhythms that govern both earthly life and the deeper mysteries that lay beyond mortal understanding. In their measured chimes, Master Aldrich heard an echo of the deeper harmony that connected all human service to the divine order that sustained both healer and patient, teacher and student. in the endless cycle of suffering and comfort that define the human condition. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities for service. New students eager to learn the arts of healing, and new reports from distant communities where graduates of the school continued to serve those in need. But tonight, as Master Aldrich settled into the peaceful rest that concluded each day of faithful service, he carried with him the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing that his life had contributed to the great work of reducing human suffering and preserving the dignity that belonged to every person who faced the universal challenges of illness and mortality. The story of Master Aldrich and the transformation of medieval medicine through the crucible of epidemic disease would continue to unfold through the lives and service of countless physicians who followed in his footsteps, each adding their own chapter to the ongoing narrative of healing arts and human compassion. In the quiet darkness of the medieval night, the legacy of the plague physician lived on as an eternal reminder of medicine's highest calling and humanity's capacity to find light even in the deepest shadows of suffering and fear. Epilogue. The enduring symbol. And so, dear listener, our journey through the life and times of Master Aldrich draws to its gentle close. As we have seen, the figure of the plague physician emerged from the crucible of humanity's darkest medical crisis to become an enduring symbol of dedication and service. The distinctive costume, born from desperate necessity, evolved into an icon of medical commitment that transcended its practical origins. In the quiet moments before sleep claims us, we might reflect on the timeless lessons embedded in this medieval tale. The transformation of a peaceful scholar into a legendary healer reminds us that greatness often arises not from seeking fame, but from faithful response to unexpected challenges. Master Aldrich's willingness to serve when others fled, to remain present when hope seemed lost, and to find meaning in the midst of suffering speaks to possibilities that exist within every human heart. The protective costume that once seemed so alien and frightening became, through dedicated service, a symbol of comfort and hope. This transformation suggests that our initial fears and prejudices need not define our ultimate understanding, and that symbols of healing can emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. As you drift toward peaceful slumber, perhaps you will dream not of the grim reaper that the plague physician sometimes resembled, but of the compassionate healer who lived within that leather shell. For in the end, it was not the costume that made Master Aldrich memorable, but the courage and kindness he brought to his calling, and the reminder he offers us all that even in our darkest hours, there are always those who will step forward to serve with wisdom, dedication, and love. Sleep well, knowing that the light of human compassion continues to shine through the ages, carried forward by every person who chooses service over safety, presence over flight, and hope over despair. In their faithful example, the true legacy of the plague physician lives on, a gentle guardian watching over humanity's ongoing journey through both shadow and light. Sweet dreams, dear listener, and may your rest be peaceful and restorative.